must admit, I feel like a bit of a wolf in sheep's clothing. Nor am I from the Nordics, but I'm also here representing a technology company, so I'm not an M&A practitioner. That being said, I can promise you there is at least one expert on the stage today. And I'll just give a quick introduction to myself before I pass over to Sarah. So my name is Richard Sissons. I work for DealCloud. We're a market-leading private equity software provider. Prior to that, and I can sort of claim to having a little bit of expertise, is I worked for KPMG's Mobility 2030 for a number of years, which is an advisory group that advises on the future of automotives, but also energy markets as well. That being said, I'll pass over to Sarah to introduce herself.
Yes, Sarah Hempel. I'm the head of sustainability at Axcel Management. We are a mid-market Nordic private equity firm based in Copenhagen.
Brilliant, thank you. So, funnily enough, March 2021 marks a year of SFDR classifications and being introduced. So that leads us into the question of where are we now and how have we got here from an ESG perspective?
Well, it's a really good time to be in sustainability, I have to say that. In the last couple of years, there's been a momentous shift in interest in the finance community. And I would say I have a background in corporate, and what it has taken corporates to do in sort of 10 years, I feel I observe happening in the finance community within a couple of years. Things are moving really fast. And you could say it's a perfect storm. You could also say the stars are aligning. And by stars, I mean all the various stakeholder groups that we are accountable towards. So as an investor, asset owners, LPs, our investors are asking us to do this. We're competing with others to show that we're great at it. Our portfolio companies are increasingly being met with requirements from their customers, from their employees, and then the regulatory framework is massive and is currently only the beginning of it is being implemented. And all of these factors together have driven an enormous amount of focus and efforts in sustainability.
That's really interesting. And so in terms of what LPs are looking for, how does that pass down to Axcel?
Yeah, well, what we've seen, or what I've observed, is a huge shift in the level of sophistication of questions. So we've gone within a couple of years from, do you have an ESG policy? Are you signed up to PRI? To long, detailed questions about how we're addressing the numerous frameworks out there, data-specific questions. What is the CO2 footprint of your entire portfolio? What are your targets? What are you committed to? So the level of sophistication is increasing very fast.
Yeah. And in terms of how that's up to today, is that, you mentioned about sort of quantifying it, so around CO2 emissions. Would you say that there's more qualifying at the moment? Is it quantitative, or how are people looking at it and thinking about it?
Increasing focus on quantified data. Yeah. So I think a lot of investors started where it was a little easier. They started out in public and they started collecting some data there, but now the questions are also coming to us, and we are increasingly expected to be able to provide ESG data on all of our companies. And if it wasn't coming from LPs, it's underpinned by the regulation that we're seeing in development now, but there's the CSRD, which will be implemented in a couple of years, which is pointing towards increasing data reporting requirements on non-financial metrics from mainly large companies, but we expect that also to trickle down into the supply chains.
And so how do you anticipate that impacts your portfolio companies, for example?
Keeps them busy. Yeah, so the funny thing is you would think that it was going to be this big burdensome exercise, and I'll admit I was worried when I sent out my first monster Excel sheet. Here we go, let's get all this data in, but surprisingly most of it is pretty intuitive and not that difficult to collect. And then there is the CO2 baselining, which does take a little bit of effort, but there's a variety of solutions out there to solve that. You can go tech-based, or you can use consultants, and depending on the company, you'll find what the right solution is. But I think we have to see this as a market standard and something that is actually only going to increase.
Yeah. And then in terms of that, how much is greenwashing as a risk?
Greenwashing is an immense risk. It's an immense risk because we all want to look good, and we all want to get the benefit of our effort. So when we invest in sustainability capabilities or initiatives, we want to see a return on that investment, so we want to talk about it and get the benefit, but we risk saying too much too fast, and we risk also getting so caught up in the storytelling that we forget what it's actually about. It's not just about having the right stamp or selling more because you could call it green. It's actually making meaningful changes in the way you design products, produce products, think about your business, operate your business. So yes, a big risk, and you're seeing the watchdogs also stepping up. So it's watchdogs in terms of the media, it's watchdogs in terms of NGOs who've always been there, but also in terms of litigation. So recently there are examples of climate litigation, and I think that's a really interesting and important development to keep an eye on, that it can also become a regulatory matter.
Okay, that's really interesting. And then in terms of, you mentioned before as well, companies going down the route of either looking to tech to undergo this transformation and to deal with the reporting burden, but also to use consultants. What are some companies using for that consideration? How are they deciding on what route to go down?
Yeah, I think right now I'm a bit of a gatekeeper, if I'm honest, in our portfolio, and that's given the size of our portfolio and the size of companies we invest in. So my role is to also be an advisor to this group of 20 companies who are SMEs. And my current preference is to learn how to do things, embed the understanding of the concepts in the company. So I'm more towards consultants, and let's learn how to do a baseline so we can do it ourselves every year. And in most of the companies, it's not even that complex an exercise. So let's rather go that way rather than relying on tech-based solutions where data quality currently is not great yet. I think those tech-based solutions are great when you have a big portfolio and you need to quickly get an overview to start making decisions. So it depends on the situation, but yeah.
Okay. And then in terms of target companies, how, say for example, their reporting isn't up to the standard that you might expect from your side, how do you go about assessing a company from an ESG perspective that's a target?
Yeah, so then it's actually very qualitative. So when we have of course integrated ESG in all stages of the investment process, and when we're doing due diligence, most of the companies we look at don't have a lot of data. So it's qualitative, and we assess, identify the material ESG topics, and then ask the companies to describe how they're managing it, and then the consultants can help us to do a deeper analysis on any things that we think will be problematic.
Absolutely. So that then brings us on to, what does the future look like? Yeah. What's the direction of ESG in the landscape?
Well, I think it's only going to increase. I think a lot of people feel that we're overwhelmed, and this is this new thing that has taken over, and maybe a little bit of, when is it going to go away? But I don't think it's going away. I think it's only going to get bigger. And we have to remember that this is a very complex agenda that the companies and the finance community have largely ignored for a long time. And now we're coming to a reckoning. And it's going to take a lot of time to go from where we are today to where we need to be in terms of developing more sophisticated tools and capabilities for managing this whole agenda in a pragmatic way. And I think that what's really important to keep in mind is sustainability can very quickly become an effort of frameworks. We love frameworks, and we love ticking boxes, and we love new ways of framing it. And I think there's a risk that we lose focus on what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is change our values, and we're trying to bring value-based thinking into our decisions, into how we source, how we design, how we operate, how we sell. And if we get caught up in ticking boxes and putting stamps in marketing and hiring a bunch of people to just do that, it becomes a glorified compliance activity. And that's not the point. The point is we change the way we think, and we change the way we do business. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, you can.
I think that's super interesting.
I read that
Speaking of ticking boxes and making lists, the MSCI Emerging Markets ESG Leaders Index was heavily overweighted, tilted towards Gazprom. It was a favorite in this index. Can you talk about those kind of risks? If you buy indexes from somebody, you touched upon it, but could you?
I think that currently there's a lack of nuance, and there's a lack of credibility in a lot of these indices, unfortunately. So the data quality, as we've spoken about, is not currently very good. So there's a lot of estimation, and then there's a lot of assumptions in models that, if you look at it, don't really make sense. I think it was also and a lot of also outside-in assessment that's not been qualified. So you've seen the corporate nights, most sustainable companies in the world. I think Volkswagen was #1, and the year after they had the whole scandal, right? So I think you have to take these things with a grain of salt, and they can be informative, but they're not definitive. You really need to use your own mind and do your due diligence. Yeah.
Can I follow up one more? Sorry.
Yeah.
What are you doing different from last week? How has these 2 weeks changed your job?
So yeah, as I said, it's moving fast. In the last 2 weeks, so my current obsession is figuring out how to work with a carbon price internally. So that's not solved yet, but that's the newest. We've committed to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and we want to embed climate change more thoroughly in our way of thinking. I would like us to work with a price on carbon, and I want to find a smart way to do it.
Thank you.
There have been some occasions where peers of yours in the Nordics have raised new funds where carry is partly tied to ESG impact.
Yeah.
I mean, do you see that becoming more mainstream, or will it be something for the impact investors?
I mean, I think I'm not sure if it's going to become a trend in the generalist space. I think if you're an impact investor, it's almost a must-have. You can't really sell a product and say this product is equal impact and finance return, and then not tie carry to impact. So, as we see, and we do see a growth in impact funds. So in that way, I see it growing. But in the generalist fund, I haven't seen it yet. It could be. Maybe it takes one, right? As soon that's also it. As soon as one does it, then the others follow. So. Let's see who's going to be the first.
Scanning the room to see if there are any additional questions. So, in terms of the outlook, would you say that if you're taking the barometer, are you generally more positive or more negative on the side of?
I'm positive. I'm absolutely positive. I think, as I said, I think this is here to stay. I think that there's been somehow an awakening in the minds of a lot of people, and what exactly has driven that, no one can really say. Pointed on one thing, I think it's a convergence of a number of trends. I think the younger generation is even more concerned with this than we are, and the millennials are getting old, so they're taking an increasing position. So I do think that this is going to be meaningful.
I just wanted to just to put climate change in perspective, and to quote something from one of the sort of more topical political things. And Putin recently said, in reference to nuclear warfare, what is the world without Russia? And I just wonder if actually we'd be better asking the question is, what is the world without our environment or without ESG?
Yeah.
Do you, in terms of how we split between the environmental and the societal, do you see them being purely bundled together, that as a company or as companies they have to be tied together, or is it that they have to look at them separately?
Both. So they are intrinsically interlinked. The reason climate change matters, the reason the environment matters, is because it affects people. And that's actually where the climate litigation takes its departure in. It's about the human rights to life. So they're in that way interlinked, but the social topic on its own is also, it deserves its own attention. And that's everything from gender diversity, non-discrimination, harassment, to inequality and income, fair income, right? So it's a huge, and that one is much more difficult to work with, much more difficult to measure. So it's the one that's, even in the EU legislation, it's sort of there, but it's in very general terms, and no one has really, it seems like it's this problem we're not quite sure how to bring into business in an operational way. There are frameworks, but it's tough.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I think that's all we've got time for, so thank you.